If you're a spec shopper, there's no doubt that Samsung's Odyssey Neo G8 caught your eye earlier this year at CES. It certainly caught our attention as the first 4K gaming monitor with a 240Hz refresh rate, and promises of brightness and HDR performance on the level of the super ultra-wide Odyssey Neo G9. It's not unbearably expensive like Samsung's Wild Arc concept either. It's $1,500 so still definitely up there even compared to other monitors in this class, but the premium isn't unreasonable considering the super high refresh rate. It's a very impressive monitor for gamers who want the best of the best, and it makes a lot more sense now that graphics cards like the RTX 4090 can push 150 plus frames per second in games at 4K. It's not a slam dunk recommendation though, there are still a few problems, one of which I hope Samsung can address in a future update. Before getting into all of it, like this video if you enjoy, get subscribed, we're publishing a ton of new videos every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss them. The Neo G8 certainly looks like a monitor worth $1,500 with a really nice glossy white finish on the back, along with Samsung's Core Sync lighting ring. You can sync that up with whatever's on your screen at the time, and it looks really nice for a little bit of mood lighting. Setting up the monitor isn't completely toolless, but it's still easy. You have the base, stand, and monitor, and they all have pre-thread screws in the right places, so you just grab a screwdriver and get everything set up in a minute or two. The stand is pretty good. You get just less than 5 inches of height adjustment, 22 degrees of tilt, and 30 degrees of swivel. You can also rotate the monitor vertically, which actually works really well considering the aggressive 1000R curve of the display. If you want, you can also wall mount it with a pretty hefty adapter that Samsung includes in the box. The stand has these two long protruding legs, so you'll need a pretty big desk for this monitor, not to mention the screen itself is 32 inches big. Thankfully, the legs are thin, so you can still place stuff around it and set up your desk how you like. Around the back of the stand, you have this little rubber hook for cable management, as well as a bit of plastic that you can snap in to hide all of your connections. It's fine, it works, but Samsung has much better cable management solutions on much cheaper monitors. The Odyssey G7, for example, the $500-ish one, has this nice routing channel that runs through the stand, and it doesn't feel great not seeing that same attention to detail on a monitor that's almost 3 times as expensive. For ports, you have two HDMI 2.1, which can handle 4K at 120Hz for consoles like the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. But if you're using a PC, you'll want the DisplayPort connection, which is the only one that can unlock 240Hz at 4K. In either case, there's a setting in the menu that allows you to quickly jump between 120Hz and 240Hz depending on what you're doing. All right, I mentioned spec shoppers at the top of this video because the Neo G8 kind of looks impossible based on the spec sheet. 2000 nits of peak brightness, contrast on the levels of OLEDs, and quantum HDR 2000. Whatever that's supposed to mean. Samsung likes to talk up its monitors with pretty misleading specs, including using badges like Quantum HDR that Samsung made up for itself. In reality, the Neo G8 doesn't have a certification with the industry standard display HDR, and the specs, although not totally inaccurate, are not what you should expect to see on a day-to-day basis. In my testing, the monitor topped out at around 800 nits for the full screen. It can get brighter in smaller areas, some of which can actually reach 2000 nits for very brief periods of time. But let's be honest, you don't want 2000 nits blasting you in the face all the time from only a few inches away. 800 nits is still super bright for a monitor like this. And it uses mini LEDs for the backlight with close to 1200 local dimming zones. It can get really contrasty with HDR turned on, but unfortunately it can still never achieve the perfect black levels of an OLED panel. You start from pure black, you're going to have higher contrast. It gets close to OLED, but a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio? No. The Neo G8 isn't as bright as Samsung says, but it is as beautiful. Colors look fantastic on this monitor, especially with HDR turned on. It covers 100% of sRGB, 82% of Adobe RGB, and 90% of DCI-P3 based on the results I got with my Spider X. The color error overall was 2.1 out of the box, which is just above okay. It's not bad, but Samsung says this monitor comes factory calibrated, so I hope to see a little better color performance out of the box. The good news is that there were no colors that were really far off the mark. Everything hovered between an error of 1 to 3, so it's not like the reds or the greens look horrible. Everything looks really balanced, even if it's not on the level of a professional grade monitor that you'd use for proper color work. You can easily adjust your picture settings to dial in a look you like or calibrate the monitor further as well. I've always liked Samsung's menus, and it's the same tried and true version on the Neo G8. Pressing up on the 4 directional buttons gives you quick access to picture settings like brightness, contrast, and sharpness, but the full menu is still super easy to get around. Samsung includes a handful of picture modes like an FPS mode that cuts a bunch of contrast and an RPG mode that does the opposite, but the only really useful one here is the sRGB mode, so you can limit the colors to that color space if you're editing in Photoshop or color grading in Premiere. The specs of the Neo G8 are definitely off, but that doesn't mean it's a bad gaming monitor. It's a really, really good gaming monitor. Booting up Cyberpunk 2077 with HDR turned on was kind of amazing. This monitor looks fantastic with HDR turned on, particularly because it has really good black levels. It's not OLED perfect black levels, but I measured as low as 0.05 nits. Contrast is great and the colors just pop off the screen. It's not just Cyberpunk either. Shadow of the Tomb Raider looked amazing. It made me forget this game is over 4 years old at this point. Modern Warfare 2 looked fantastic. Even games without HDR like Sackboy: A Big Adventure get a big bump in contrast from the local dimming and showcase bright, vibrant colors. On top of the great gaming performance, you get FreeSync Premium Pro certification for the monitor, and it works with NVIDIA G-Sync. It's not certified as G-Sync compatible, but I tested with an NVIDIA GPU and G-Sync worked just fine, so it doesn't matter if you have AMD or NVIDIA, you can still use variable refresh rate. My main issue with gaming is that only a few graphics cards are able to take advantage of the full 240 Hz, and only in some games. If you want the immersive cinematic HDR experience, you're not going to hit anywhere near 240 FPS in games like God of War and Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K. The RTX 4090 is the only GPU that even kind of makes sense, and even then it hovers in the 180 FPS territory in these demanding games with upscaling turned on. The Neo G8 could make sense if you play a lot more competitive games, things like Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, Valorant. It'll be much easier to drive the full refresh rate even if you don't have a top-end GPU. Still, you definitely need a beefy gaming rig to drive 4K, much less at a full 240 Hz. The Neo G8 is a great monitor. I only have a reservation because Samsung also offers the Neo G7 for $400 cheaper. It comes with the same number of local dimming zones, same brightness and contrast specs, but a 165 Hz refresh rate. That's still super high, and it makes a lot more sense for what most GPUs are actually capable of today. If you want a monitor that ticks all the boxes though, the Neo G8 does that. Just be aware that more often than not, you won't be able to take advantage of the full 240 Hz, especially if you like immersive AAA games. If you lean heavier on those games and don't play a lot of competitive titles, you can probably sacrifice the refresh rate and save a little money in the process. The Alienware 34QD OLED is a few $100 cheaper and is even more immersive than the Neo G8 with its ultra-wide aspect ratio. And if you don't like ultra-wide monitors, Samsung's Odyssey Neo G7 is a solid alternative as well. If you want the best of both worlds, there's nothing that can touch the Neo G8 right now. It's the only 4K gaming monitor with a 240 Hz refresh rate on the market, and it doesn't sacrifice image quality or HDR performance to reach those impressive specs. It looks fantastic, it performs excellently, it's a little expensive, but not unheard of for a monitor in this class. Totally easy to recommend, assuming you can pair it with a top spec gaming rig to take advantage of the 240 Hz refresh rate. But I want to know what you think about the Neo G8 in the comments below. Does 240 Hz at 4K even make sense? And if you're going to pick up this monitor, what rig are you planning to pair it with? Down there, you can also find a link to my written review in the description, and you can help us get closer to the 1 million subscriber milestone by getting subscribed. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, here are 2 videos that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy.